It sort of turns these organizations inside out and back to front. When you put a lie into the heart of the organization, it turns an organization that's supposed to be protecting women against male violence into an organization that's coercing and bullying women. So there's a big reset going on right now, and lots of organizations are resisting it because for the past 15 years, they've told themselves and told the rest of the world that the law said something else. So it's huge, kind of cross society, big reset on the meaning of sex and the fact that women's rights matter.
You must be some kind of therapist.
Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Maya Forstater. She probably needs no introduction for many of our listeners, but in case you're new to the whole gender-critical political debates, here's a little of her claim to fame. She is the co-founder and CEO of Sex Matters, a human rights charity campaigning for clarity on sex in law and policy in the UK. You might have recognized my former guest, Helen Joyce, as another prominent member of Sex Matters. Sex Matters were interveners on the winning side in the recent For Women Scotland Supreme Court case on the meaning of woman in the Equality Act in the UK. So that's mostly what we're going to talk about today. In case you don't know, Maya came into the gender debate as the claimant in an employment tribunal test case on belief discrimination when she lost her job at the Center for Global Development after tweeting and writing about sex and gender. Her case established that ordinary beliefs about the two sexes are covered by the protected characteristic of belief in the Equality Act 2010. Maya, so glad you could make it. Thanks for joining us.
No worries.
All right. So just in case anyone's new to this and doesn't know your backstory, what's sort of the elevator pitch version of your claim to fame?
I was an ordinary mum, an ordinary person doing my job. My job wasn't about sex and gender, but in 2018, the UK government started consulting on its plan at the time to reform the Gender Recognition Act towards self-ID. I worked at a think tank and I thought, well, I should be able to think about this. And so I tweeted about it. And quite quickly, I got reported to HR. The organization I worked for, the headquarters, is in Washington, D.C., and it was actually people in the US who complained about me. And the organization at first said, oh, well, it's a controversial topic. What she's saying is nuanced. Just put a disclaimer on your tweets. All views my own, which I did. But then they got in some EDI consultants to investigate, and they wrote a report on me. And over the next 6 months, they gradually decided to get rid of me. So when my contract came to an end, and I was due to carry on working there because I'd been fundraising with them for another big project, they let me go, thinking that I didn't have any employment rights. And in fact, I didn't think I had any employment rights because I was not on a full-time employment contract. But there were a bunch of feminist lawyers who were looking for a case like mine, a belief discrimination case. So we brought the case in 2019 that the belief that sex is real, immutable, and important is a philosophical belief covered against discrimination, and initially lost in 2019, which was when J.K. Rowling first came into the debate the day after I lost. She tweeted about me. I didn't know she was going to do that, and my life kind of changed at that moment because the case became internationally known. 2021, we won the appeal, so that created the precedent that this belief is protected. Since then, there have been 33 cases, I'm told, that have named Forstater as precedent, and then hundreds of other people who've told me, basically, they've said my name at work and it saved their job. It stopped an investigation, stopped them being bullied, enables people to stop being discriminated against in hiring venues, and all kinds of things. And in the course of that, it took 4 years altogether, the case, and during the course of that, I set up Sex Matters.
So you're basically a 21st century Rosa Parks.
I wouldn't say that, but
I don't know. Her story comes to mind. I mean, she stood up for something basic, like how about we all get to sit wherever we want on the bus, and that emboldened a whole movement. I mean, there's been a lot downstream of what you've done, and I'm heartened to hear that. It does make me realize though that something I should probably ask you later because it's not really the meat of our conversation today, but is like what is up with people in the UK getting arrested over tweets? That is something I would love your insight into because I don't understand it. We have, freedom of speech protections here in the US. But let's get into because that's your backstory, and thank you for sharing that. And, that sort of positions you as someone who's involved in the fight for women's rights and freedom of belief in the UK. And so, I've known who you are for a while, but decided to reach out within the last couple months because of this recent judgment. Can you tell us about what exactly the recent judgment with 4 women in Scotland entailed?
So, Foreman Scotland's case has been going on for almost as long as mine. They are a grassroots group of women in Scotland who are concerned about sex and gender. And they figured out that a way to test what the meaning of sex is in the Equality Act was to take the Scottish government to court over a quite small bit of how the law in Scotland interacts with the Equality Act, which was over whether the Scottish government had the right to set a policy for basically for kind of quotas of women on public boards that said the aim is to try and get at least 50% of any board of a public institution to be women, but asterisk, what they meant by women was anyone who identified as a woman. And so Forum in Scotland took them to court over that and won, I think back in 2022. So the court then in Scotland ruled that a woman definitely wasn't anyone who says they were a woman. So then the Scottish government went back and changed their guidance and said, okay, well, a woman is a woman or somebody with a gender recognition certificate. So these are people who've legally changed their legal sex. They've obtained gender recognition. So that wasn't self ID, but it's still a group of male people being counted as women. And so Forum in Scotland took them back to court again, started the process again. It came up through the courts in Scotland. We intervened in the last round in Scotland and then in this very last round in the Supreme Court. So it's been quite a long road. And eventually the Supreme Court judges were asked to rule on this question of what does sex mean for the purposes of this public boards thing, but actually for the purposes of the whole of the Equality Act. And the Equality Act basically says don't discriminate against people on the basis of race, disability, age, sex, and so on, apart from where you can, because there are lots of places where it's the right thing to do to treat people differently because of disability or age, for example. And there are situations where it's the right thing to do to treat people differently because of sex. Because if you don't treat women differently from men, you end up with only male athletes, for example, and you need an exception to the Equality Act in order to provide single-sex spaces, everything from toilets, changing rooms, to women's refuges and, programs for women in STEM or anywhere where women have been underrepresented. And all of those things, we've been told for the past 15 years that the Equality Act says trans women are women. We didn't think the Equality Act said trans women are women, but it wasn't clear. And so Forum in Scotland went to court. We came in as interveners, so like an amicus brief, to help the court to understand the legal basis. Our lawyer got an hour to speak, and he sort of unpicked the two laws, the Gender Recognition Act and the Equality Act, and showed the Supreme Court a way through so that they could the problem that they had was that the Gender Recognition Act says on the face of it that it allows a person to change their sex for all purposes. And the question was, well, what the hell does that mean? And a lot of lawyers looked at that and they said, well, on the face of it, that's what the law says. the law can do magic. And we said, well, it can't. And the Supreme Court agreed with us and with Forward in Scotland, and there was one other group of interveners on our side, which was a group of lesbians. And their argument was no one's sexually attracted to a piece of paper. If you're going to define gay and lesbian, which they do in the Equality Act for the purposes of protecting people against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, then you've got to know what a man is and what a woman is to know what a lesbian is. And they made that case very coherently, and the court got it.
So, in trying to follow along, I'm hearing that a lot of this started with the specific protection that was designed to put an equal number of women on boards. And so, how woman is defined in that context can affect whether some sort of decision-making body is composed of an equal mixture of men and women or entirely men with half of them identifying as women. So obviously that matters. Can you give us an example of what types of boards um, is this affected by?
I mean, I think anything, sort of National Health Service, investment, um, education boards, but it was more the principle of it, and also it was a sort of clever move by Forward in Scotland because of um, the detail of how the UK and Great Britain, England, Scotland, and Wales interact. It's not a federal country, but there are sort of odd interactions between the different nations. There was a very hard link between the definition of sex in the Equality Act and what the Scottish Government was allowed to do. And the Scottish Government was only allowed to do this board thing if they used the exact definition of sex in the Equality Act. So it was more um, the reason that Four Women Scotland brought the case was to find out what the definition was, as much as to test this board thing. But the board policy provided an opportunity to do that. But it was interesting, when we sort of started on the case, we thought, well, this is not um, it's not it's not an immediately attractive place to test this principle. It's not like a rape crisis centre or women's sports, where it's really obvious why you need to be clear who the men are and who the women are. But like you say, on a board, if you have, even if it's a board that's 50-50, and it's not necessarily about a women's thing, but you have someone on there saying, as a woman, I think this, my experience as a woman is something that I bring to this board, and this person isn't a woman, then, everyone on that board has to kind of politely nod along because they're all there. And this person isn't a woman. They're defeating the whole object of the thing. And obviously, men can be on boards too. So trans women can be on boards too. It's not saying that they can't be on a board. It's just saying they don't count as being women. And it was interesting in the Supreme Court, it was 5 judges, 3 men and 2 women. So it was kind of a panel. And the you could see it took place over 2 days, and you could see the judges kind of going through, peak trans sort of thought process while they were thinking about it. And at one point, one of the female judges said, "Yeah, what if there was there haven't been that many female Supreme Court judges. There haven't been that many female senior judges at all." And she said, "Well, what if there was a trans woman on the Supreme Court saying, 'I'm a woman'?" And, these judges, they're, a bit older than me. They've lived through a lot of sex discrimination on their way up, and they understand what that means. And they understand that a trans woman hasn't had that same experience. They might have had other experiences, but it's not the experience of being a woman in a man's world. And they sort of got that as a panel.
It seems like there were moments for people involved of making that shift in thought process from this sort of utopian view that I think many people, a decreasing number of people, but some people still hold, right? That we can give so-called trans rights, whatever that means, to trans people, and it doesn't take away anything from anyone. Sort of that shift from what's the harm to wait a minute, that is a man claiming to speak for me as a woman, in a situation where actually my perspective as a woman matters, and I would have a lot more trust in any other member of my sex to represent our interests.
Yeah, absolutely. And when um, the gender recognition when I came into this in 2018, the government was consulting on gender recognition reform, so giving out more of these certificates more easily. And the whole argument of the other side at that point was, well, it's only admin; it doesn't make a difference. It's not going to give us the right to be in women's spaces or to, do anything. It's just personal admin. And then it turns out when we went to the Supreme Court and we proved that actually it is just admin, it doesn't give you a right to all these things. They said, hold on a second, we think it does. So there was a sort of bait and switch going on. And yeah, this idea of, well, why don't you give them what they want? It's not gonna cause harm. And now that we are able to claim back the right to women's spaces, to women's names, to women's voices, um, it's clear that, rights are pie, as they say. They used to say to us, rights are not pie, you can have it all, but once we want it back, it turns out, um, there is a conflict.
Sort of that idea that there are no solutions, only trade-offs, and this sort of shift in thinking that tends to happen for most people as they mature, of realizing that life is full of trade-offs. So besides board membership, what does this accomplish? What rights and protections does it give women and people in general, and what does it not?
So, um, the as I said, the underlying structure of the Equality Act is, um, don't discriminate, and it has a whole, um kind of rationale to it, which is you're thinking about different groups of people who have different shared experiences and whose vulnerability or disadvantage has something in common. And so the core thing they said was men and women are two different groups. In order to recognize their experience, their potential disadvantages, potential unfairnesses in society, you have to recognize these two groups. So that's the bedrock. And then you apply that to uh, you well, we have something called the public sector equality duty, which requires that any public body, in setting a policy, thinks about how its policy affects different groups and makes sure that it's not unfair. But the problem was, because people had already included trans women into the category of women, every time they thought about a policy where there'd be a trade-off between women and trans women, they'd say, well, it's good for trans women, so it's good for women. So, I mean, that's huge, resetting that and saying every time you think about a policy where there's a trade-off, you now have to understand that trans women are men. They're in the men's side. Women, including trans men, including non-binary people who women who identify as non-binary, the female people are a group, and you have to think about those people in every time you spend public money, set a law, set a policy. And then specifically, there are these exceptions about when you're allowed to have single-sex services, when you're allowed to have single-sex sports, when you're allowed to employ somebody into a job as a woman. Most jobs are for a man or a woman, but if you're going to employ somebody in a rape crisis center, for example, you can say that's a job for a woman. Um, and we've had in Scotland, there was a man who identified as a woman running a rape crisis center. Um, it sort of turns organizations inside out and back to front. When you put a lie into the heart of the organization, it turns an organization that's supposed to be protecting women against male violence into an organization that's coercing and bullying women. So there's a big reset going on right now, and lots of organizations are resisting it because for the past 15 years, they've told themselves and told the rest of the world that the law said something else. So it's huge, kind of cross society, big reset on the meaning of sex and the fact that women's rights matter.
Sounds like it's going to be messy in some ways that are similar to what I see happening in the US right now, where the Trump administration is aligning policies much more with how us, gender critical biological realists want to think about these particular issues. Never mind whether you're a liberal, conservative, pro or anti-Trump on any other issue. If you look at what the Trump administration is doing with regard to this issue, a lot of it is in alignment with what gender critical people have been advocating for. And yet, just because the government says a particular thing, especially when you live in such a polarized country as ours in the US, doesn't necessarily mean that all these ideologues working in jobs that receive some public funding or that should theoretically be impacted by these laws doesn't mean that their worldview is going to shift. It doesn't mean that they're just going to cooperate. A lot are kind of looking for ways around it, trying to evade things, or maybe even engaging in what they think of as a noble act of resistance. So it seems like we have our struggles here in the US where I hear about something that I think, well, wait a minute, that's now illegal in our country. Like schools shouldn't be hiding kids' so-called identities from their parents anymore, for instance. Or there's parts of the country where, you know, so-called gender affirming care for minors is now illegal. And you think, okay, that shouldn't be happening, but it is happening because of the culture, the mentality, these things that are slower to change. Um, it sounds like you're saying that similar things are happening in the UK, where now you have these legal definitions and protections, and some organizations are going to be very quick to get on board because they've been waiting for those protections, but others not so much.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, quite quickly after the judgment, we had quite a few of the big sports organizations, netball, cricket, and football, soccer, all went right. Yeah, single sex is single sex, and they came out with good policies. Um, Lots of employers and organizations are saying they're going to wait for more guidance from, we have a regulator called the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and the regulator is working on new guidance. So lots of them are saying they're going to wait for guidance. But the thing with the law is, um, when the Supreme Court ruled, what they ruled was this was always the law. It's not a new law. This was the law since 2010. And in fact, it was the law since 1975, which was the Sex Discrimination Act, which then got rolled into the Equality Act. So this has always been the law. And women who said things, who lost their job, were losing their job just for saying what the law is. Um, so, whether organizations step in line slowly or quickly, I think they're going to have to step in line, but I do think there are going to be more court cases.
So tell us about the meaning of a gender recognition certificate. What did that mean? What does it now mean? What does it accomplish for someone who holds it, and what does it not accomplish?
The Gender Recognition Act was passed in 2004, and it was passed, the UK uh, resisted enabling people to change their birth certificates for a long time, and they were eventually forced into it by a court case. So they were taken to the European Court of Human Rights by a trans woman called Christine Goodwin, who was a man, a father, a grandfather, who transitioned at the age of 50, I think. And and in the UK, kind of similar to the US, it's not a very uh, coordinated system. So you can change your passport, you can change your driving license, you can change your healthcare records just by changing them. They're not all linked together. Whereas in countries like France and Germany, it's all very linked together. So the only thing that you couldn't change at that point was your birth certificate. And sometimes, when you go to open a bank account or go get insurance or something, especially in 2004, kind of pre-digital, they'd say, bring in your birth certificate and your electricity bill and your passport, into the office so that we can work out that you are who you say you are. And so Christine Goodwin said that when he had to bring his birth certificate into the bank to get insurance, it revealed that he was male. I mean, I've seen video of Christine Goodwin. There was no doubt that he was male. I mean, they might have been being polite, but it wasn't a secret that was revealed by the piece of paper. But when you go to the European Court of Human Rights, which is, it's a sort of court of appeal, you've exhausted the national courts. You don't give evidence. It's all lawyers. So I'm not even sure if the judges saw Christine Goodwin. All they saw were the words on paper. And so they saw this was a woman. This was a woman who was being outed by this piece of paper. And this piece of paper was, government issued and was the only thing that would let somebody know that this person wasn't born a woman. And the European Court of Human Rights said that was a breach of Article 8, which is the right to privacy, private life correspondence of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is it's an important right, but it's a limited right. The government breaches your privacy all the time, every time it asks for your information, every time it records your information. And if it's a lawful reason, they can do it. But because this was a, analog piece of paper, and the only way to show it was to show your sex, even if they don't actually need your sex for you to get the insurance, they said that the UK government was outside of its commitments in terms of human rights, so they had to legislate. So then they brought in the Gender Recognition Act. Oh, and one thing I'd say about the Goodwin case was what the European Court of Human Rights said was Christine Goodwin was a post-operative transsexual and had been operated on by the National Health Service. So the argument was basically, well, the government has done this to you. The government has enabled this treatment of your body with the expectation that you're going to be able to live as the opposite sex. Well, now they have to follow through on the deal. So it was, medicine and law. And that's what we've seen all the way through, is this kind of passing the buck between medicine and law. And so they said, well, the government has to do something. So then it was Labour government at the time, and they passed a law which was sort of at the forefront of gender law. And they said, well, you don't have to have surgery. They didn't make that a requirement. You just had to have a diagnosis, and you had to have lived for 2 years in that gender, which meant having pay slips, electricity bills, whatever, with your name and identity on it. And so they allowed people to then get a new birth certificate, or what looks like a new birth certificate, showing that they were born in the opposite sex. And this law said, changes your sex for all purposes. And when they did that, they sort of said, well, we've been legislating about sex and gender for hundreds of years. There are so many laws about sex. It would be too much trouble to go through each of them and say which one does and doesn't get changed by the certificate. So just for the purposes of neatness and coherence, we'll say changes your sex for all purposes. But it turns out that you can't change someone's sex for almost any purpose. And so even when they passed the Gender Recognition Act, they already put some exceptions in. And the exceptions they put in were quite male, I'd say. So they put in an exception for peerages, hereditary peerages, anything to do with inheritance. If something was going to pass down the male line, it's still going to pass down the male line, even if the sister gets a gender recognition certificate and becomes a man, she doesn't get to be the baron or whatever.
Wow.
Yeah, so they put that in. They put in an exception for sex crimes because in English law or in UK law, rape is a crime that can only be done by a man, by penis. And so they put in an exception for sex crimes and an exception for parenthood. So if you're a father, you're still a father. If you're a mother, you're still a mother. So quite big areas of life they already put in exceptions for. And then when they brought in the Equality Act, there were other exceptions which weren't that it removes the gender. The Equality Act didn't talk about the gender recognition certificate at all, but it had other exceptions that said you're allowed to discriminate against somebody on the basis of gender reassignment in areas such as sport and single-sex services. So you had these two laws that didn't quite match up, and the Supreme Court, when we got there, had to think about, how do these two laws work together? And what they did was they went through the whole of the Equality Act. They went through every place in the Equality Act where sex matters, and they tested out what would it mean if woman meant female people plus males with a certificate, and men meant male people plus females with a certificate. How would our equality law work? And how would it work if those two groups meant old-fashioned men and women? And every place they tested it, they said, well, the one that works is the old-fashioned definition. So that must be what Parliament intended in 2010 when they passed this law.
I'm trying to follow along. I was so struck by what you said, because it's like there is so much entitlement, and shifting of goalposts and other problematic behaviors in the trans rights lobby. And, this idea that men should count as women when they want to steal our trophies and beat us in competitions and have access to our naked bodies. But if a woman wants to identify as a man to gain an inheritance, well, that's not allowed, right? So it's
Exactly.
this one way thing. Okay, so you kind of took us through the timeline of these shifting definitions, but where things stand now, so if a man has a gender recognition certificate, and maybe at the time he was told that this meant this makes you count as a woman for all purposes, right? Like, what does that mean? Does that entitle him to have women approve of him in their spaces? Does that entitle him to other people perceiving him the way he wants to be perceived, or just to other people lying to him? Anyway, so, it's kind of a hilariously vague phrase, but at one point, gender recognition certificate means you are entitled to be seen this way for all purposes. And what does it mean now that some limitations have been put on it?
Uh, well, we know from the Goodwin case, because the specific things that Goodwin pleaded was that at the time there wasn't same-sex marriage, and so Goodwin said he couldn't marry another man. I mean, in fact, he was heterosexual. He didn't want to marry another man, but he didn't have the right to marry another man. And so we know that gender recognition certificates count for marriage. So if somebody changes sex, and now you have same-sex marriage, but some people, some people are religious and they don't believe in same-sex marriage, but they do believe that if someone has a certificate, then that's a opposite-sex marriage. I mean, that's mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, me too.
But in any case, the terms on which you're married depend on a gender recognition certificate. Pensions, because that's what Goodwin pleaded when he went to court. But now pensions are equalised. There used to be a different retirement age for men and women, but now that's gone. So there really isn't very much that a gender recognition certificate does, and it allows you to change your birth certificate. But the other thing that was in the law was a bit of it called Section 22, which what they were thinking of was that there would be some people who really changed sex, or as close as possible to change sex, and that they would blend into their new life in their new sex, and that they wouldn't want to reveal the fact of their birth sex. And so they put these quite strenuous conditions around sharing that information. So if you find out through an official channel, so employment, or you're providing a service to someone, or you work for the tax office or whatever, if you have access to someone's files, and on that basis you find out that they've got a gender recognition certificate, you're then not allowed to share that fact or the fact of their sex with anyone else, and it's a criminal offence if you do. And although no one's been prosecuted for this criminal offence since the beginning, it makes organizations terrified because you can't, it's like kryptonite. You can't put this piece of information into your computer system that your employees might trip over. It might not know anything about Section 22 and then tell somebody and then get prosecuted for. So, which is why only around 8,000 people have gender recognition certificates. We don't know how many people identify as trans, but it might be like 100,000. So, many more than people with certificates. But a lot of organizations, what they did was, because they were so worried about tripping over this kryptonite information, they treated everyone as the sex that they identified as, rather than even going anywhere near who's got a certificate and who doesn't. So we have, the law as it is, which is the Gender Recognition Act exists. It's much less powerful than people think it is, but it does exist. And then we have the law as organizations thought it was, which was self-ID. And that we're now in this kind of, it's like Roadrunner running off the cliff. They've all been running really fast in that direction, and they've got to pull back and reassess what they've been doing.
It still boggles me that changing birth certificates is legal anywhere because it's the falsification of a historical document.
Yeah.
As if there's a single human being that has ever been born that, on the day that they came out of their mother's womb, they were like, excuse me, I was given the wrong set of genitals. Like, right? I mean, you were a baby. This imposition of an ideology that people adopt with their adolescent or adult brains. And then to say that that means I was different when I came out of the womb because I've decided now that it does. It just, and it seems like these sort of loopholes make it so easy for people to, what am I looking for? Not exactly commit identity theft, but to conceal their crimes, to, just seems so obviously problematic.
Yeah. And the thing that sort of people haven't really thought through yet, and I think we will get there, is it's not just the laws that say sex on them, where it's really obvious. If you've got a law that says sex, like we have a law on searching, like when you're searched by the police, you're only allowed to be searched by an officer of the same sex as you. So we've got a case on that at the moment, suing one of the police forces to say, sex means sex. But there are lots of other laws and policies and areas of practice that don't say sex on the face of them, but they say risk, or they say due diligence, or they say safeguarding, or they say anti-money laundering or identity. And all of those things get broken when you pretend that someone can change sex, because people can't, and you give someone a brand new identity, basically. And you tell all of the professionals that are dealing with that person, with that family, in every situation, that they can't believe their eyes. And if they see a risk, they can't do anything with it because they're afraid of, one, of being called a bigot and a transphobe, and two, potentially of legal implications, which they don't understand, but which they've told are very scary and powerful. And all of that, like you say, that culture is still there. That's not gone away. But the legal misunderstanding that allowed that culture to build up is gone.
Many of you listening to this show are concerned about an adolescent or young adult you care about who's caught up in the gender insanity and therefore at risk of medical self-destruction. I developed ROGD Repair as a resource for parents just like you. It's a self-paced online course and community that will teach you the psychology concept and communication tools the families I've consulted with have found most helpful in understanding and getting through to their children, even when they're adults. Visit rogdrepair.com to learn more about the program and use promo code SOMETherapist2025 at checkout to take 50% off your first month. That's rogdrepair.com. Maybe this is a good moment to get to that question I mentioned I had for you earlier, because as an American, I'm so accustomed to freedom of speech, freedom of belief. Doesn't mean I haven't faced cancel culture. I've been hit by the internet mob. I've had people try to come after my therapy license, which I talked to your colleague Helen Joyce about in episode 11 of my podcast. But you don't worry about going to jail for saying the wrong thing, right? Unless I mean, there are very specific things that you could say, and they basically amount to threats of violence. That could get you arrested. But, short of credible threats of violence, in America, we're accustomed to that freedom of speech and belief. Now, cultural issues are another matter. But I don't understand what is going on in the UK with regard to people getting arrested for comments on social media. I keep hearing that this is a thing. I saw someone the other day say it was like upwards of 1,000 people who had been through this, and I'm trying to understand what in UK law even allows for people to get arrested for wrongthink, and how does a case like yours, which determined that, officially in the law, holding gender critical beliefs is protected. How does all this work?
Um, I mean, there are a bunch of laws about speech which relate to the same thing you're talking about. It's basically about credible threats. You know, threats to groups of people or threats to individuals, harassment, malicious communication, which is originally, it's like making heavy breathing phone calls to somebody. If you make on the old landline, this used to happen. If you make heavy breathing phone calls, or if you send somebody, obscene, threatening mail, that's misuse of the telephone system and the mail system, and you can be prosecuted for that. Um, but a lot of that's been weaponized as being kind of, "You hurt my feelings, therefore you've threatened me." And I mean, I was under investigation by the Metropolitan Police for 18 months on about half a tweet. I did a tweet um, about a doctor who had transitioned, a male doctor who transitioned, and who had been interviewed by a bunch of Newsweek and various magazines, and had been given an award by the Doctors Association and so on for being stunning and brave. And he'd said that his patients, who were mainly Muslim women, allowed him to do intimate examinations on them when they wouldn't have done when he was a woman. And quite clearly, he was a man. Um, I'm not even sure if it's true. The whole thing may have been a fantasy, but all of these magazines quoted this thing as being, "Isn't this great and wonderful?" And so I tweeted that he enjoyed examining women without their consent, because that's, informed consent means informed consent. And he reported that to the police, and they called me up. They didn't arrest me, but they do this thing of, they call you in for a voluntary interview, which if you don't come, then they put out a warrant for your arrest. So,
How voluntary is it then?
well, it's not very voluntary. I mean, they're probably not going to put the resources on to come and arrest you. But if you try and leave, if you try and leave the country, it might cause, pop off on a computer or something. So it's like, you know, and also you don't want to be arrested randomly. It's better to get a lawyer and go in and do the interview. So I did that. Just a complete waste of police time. And it took 18 months before they said, yeah, no further action. Um, and, there's lots of that. And then there are people who, the people who've gone to prison for, I mean, actual threatening tweets. But there's a question about whether, um, how long would be a reasonable amount of time, if at all. But a lot of it is, it's the chilling effect of, the police turning up at your door. I mean, I like you, I'm so cancelled that, you get to a point where it's sort of slightly water off a duck's back. But, if you've got a normal job, um, that, it could destroy you. And people who are able to weaponize that and deploy that are able to silence debate quite effectively. And that question about whether a doctor should be able to intimately examine women who've said they want a female doctor is a serious question that still hasn't been answered.
So, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, it's that the system has been abused and misused to make out things that most free-thinking Americans, at least from our sort of cultural perspective, except for the far left ones, like we would think of as freedom of speech, freedom of belief. That's your opinion. I may or may not agree with it. I might even think that your opinion is terrible, but it's your opinion. Our American value system would kind of tend to analyze things that way, but in the UK, it gets more easily misinterpreted as if your opinion is really threatening someone, and that's sort of the justification.
Yeah, although I think it's partly just the underlying legal system. So on the other hand, we have much stronger employment rights. So, in the US, pretty much everyone's on a at-will contract and they can be told to clear their desk. And that, if that can happen to you, then that's a big chilling effect. You might have the freedom of speech, you've formally got freedom of speech, but you want your job, you want your health insurance, and so you're gonna say whatever it takes to stay in that situation. Whereas, because we have quite strong employment protections and discrimination protections, and because we've used this, it's religion or belief discrimination was the protected characteristic that I came under, and it protects you against being discriminated against because of your beliefs and because of your lack of beliefs. So it's quite powerful. And actually, um, a lot of times when they try and shut people up in authoritarian regimes, it's not necessarily that they arrest you and send you to the gulag, it's they take your job. And so having protection for your job, for being able to say what you think on the internet, turns out to be quite powerful.
I've never been to the UK, but I do get the sense that we Americans are more entrepreneurial. Like,
Oh
I
yeah,
mean, for
definitely.
me, I think, I was a punk teenager, and I was, like, very anti-American when I was maybe 16 years old, but the older I get, the more I kinda realize I'm actually, like, very American, even in my anti-authoritarian sentiments, that's pretty American too, So, I think my response when they came at me was, um I guess I better become uncancelable, I don't want to, even though the trans rights activists did not succeed in taking away my license to practice psychotherapy, there was, as you say, that chilling effect that it had where I now felt I'm on eggshells with regard to anything further that I do as a licensed therapist. So the only way that I felt comfortable kind of looking out for myself was building my career in a direction that if they come at me again and next time they succeed, well, I have other income sources. So, I started doing things as a coach. And I'm still a licensed therapist, but I'm saying, "Hey, we're doing coaching," right? And that gives me so much freedom and I know a lot of people maybe because of the type of company that I keep that I think have that mentality to create some independent income sources so that they don't feel as easily threatened by people who would try to take their careers away. But I really do get the sense that in the UK, as much as you have those protections for your employment, it's also harder to just go out and build something on your own. And so people don't have that kind of psychological safety net of, well, if they cancel me, I'll just build my
Mm.
empire on my own over here.
Yeah. I think everywhere it depends what kind of job and profession you've got. Both in terms of protection against cancellation, because it's all well and good having employment rights, but if you're in the kind of industry, if you're in the arts or journalism or, anything where it's your reputation and it's sort of, freelancers, then you haven't really got protection. But if you know, if you work for a big company or you're a teacher or you're a doctor or something, then, you know, that's a different kettle of fish. But no, I think that's right. And I'm an American, but I live here. My
Ha
parents are American.
Your parents are American. So were you born in America then?
No, I was born in the UK.
But
My
you have dual
parents came
citizenship
over.
or?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Have you spent any time living here?
A bit. So my family's from Philly and New York, but I came over as an exchange student when I was 16 and lived in Oklahoma.
Oklahoma, of all
Yeah, well, you
places.
know, if you come as an exchange student, you get picked by the family and you go where you're picked, and it tends to be the Midwest. It was great. I loved it.
You like corn?
Yeah, corn and
Cows?
marching bands and cows and rodeos and country music.
It's a novelty to you as a Brit.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, you don't, most people don't see that part of the world. It was great, and it, you know, just very different from where I grew up in North London. You know, I went to Baptist church in Oklahoma, and, you know, just a completely different world than the one I knew, and they were good people.
There's something else you said I wanted to circle back to. You talked about medicine and law passing the buck and how the NHS being run by the government, if the NHS is going to do things like fund so-called sex reassignment surgery, even though we know that the rate of success, the success rate of sex change operations is 0% because humans can't change sex. But, you know, we have these things called, for example, you know, sex reassignment surgery or whatever. And so, okay, so the logic goes as you were describing it, the NHS funds SRS or HRT or whatever you want to, and then they say, well, now that we've done this, we have an additional responsibility to this citizen. Now we have to roll out the red carpet, pave the world for them, you know, because we've transitioned their gender. I put that in air quotes. So now we have to do everything else way beyond our, you know, purview. And I mean, I guess I want to chime in on that because there's this role that my industry plays as well, the mental health industry, and we're part of this passing the buck. And it's why I've said in a previous interview, like, we need to talk about this because it's our fault. It's our fault as therapists that this madness has proliferated. So, but I do feel like passing the buck is a very good way of thinking about it because the message to therapists is simultaneously you have this responsibility to diagnose and treat gender dysphoria by adhering to this philosophy that if your patient meets these criteria and says these things about themselves, then you rubber stamp the identity, you rubber stamp the social and medical transition if that's what they want to pursue. And that's your role as a mental health provider, even though what you're actually doing by doing that is you're saying there are no further stones to turn over here, nothing to see here, no other reason psychologically that this might be the case. And you're also going way beyond your scope as a mental health provider by saying, "Oh yes, I know that this is what will be best for this person, that they should, you know, pursue these life-altering medical procedures. Why as a therapist would I know about what that really entails? But yes, I'm saying that they should go for it, right? So on the one hand, they're saying you're the gatekeeper, but also don't gatekeep because you shouldn't stand in the way. So your role is just to affirm, right? So then therapists are sent this mixed message, put in this double bind, and then they're scared either into avoiding, you know, for the ones who are just they see what's wrong with it, but they want to keep their income and their professional standing. They just avoid working with that population. I know someone who not only carefully screens all her patients, but won't work with anyone under the age of 25 just to be safe. So, you know, therapists either avoid it or they're true believers or you know, cowering in fear, right? And then we're passing the buck. We're signing off on these letters, sending them to medical professionals. I mean, in many cases, they don't require these letters anymore, but, you know, saying, oh, yes, I agree that this is what's best for this person, which how the hell do you know? Like, do you have a crystal ball? Can you see where they're going to be
Yeah.
at in 10 years?
And do you have the the license to tell society that they have to accept this promise that you've made? I mean, the therapist, the doctor thinks about the person in front of them, but they're also telling them to go out and kind of go on safari in the women's toilets. I mean, and that's how I don't know if they still do, but that was what they used to say is, like go into the shopping center in town and ask somebody where's the toilets, and see if they point you to the men's or the ladies, and if they point you to the ladies, then you're a woman. Um, and
So,
none of that was done with consent of the rest of us.
yeah, it's one of the reasons that we can't talk about this issue, psychologically speaking, without talking about cluster B personality traits and behaviors, because there's such an entitlement in that, right? That teaching people to feel entitled to being treated a certain way and to interpret others' unwillingness or reluctance to treat them that way as some kind of interpersonal violence. So it's sort of this message from, as you said, therapists who work with the individual, doctors who work with the individual. And I think, as you said in your trigonometry interview, doctors can become really narrowly focused on their area of specialty. They've gotten all excited about what they can do with modern technology to make a man look more like a woman. So they become narrowly focused on this issue, just like therapists become narrowly focused on the individual. And then somehow these professionals rubber stamping this are making decisions on behalf of everyone else and sending the patient. I mean, it's kind there's like an omnipotence in the attitude of therapists and doctors who participate in this, which I think we do. As therapists, we have our own kind of like shadow, and there can be some grandiosity in that, right? Like a lot of therapists get their personal gratification out of feeling powerful. I mean, we all need to feel powerful. I'm not saying it's a bad thing to have a little need for power and influence or a little grandiosity. Like, not everyone with any of those traits is a full blown narcissist. It can fulfill a healthy function, but as a therapist, you at least have a responsibility to kind of be self aware of where some of your motivation's coming from, that it's not all this like selfish or, excuse me, selfless, angelic, saintly place that you're coming from, that sometimes you want to experience something selfish for yourself out of the importance that you feel that you have for a patient. And I think that's such a massive blind spot with the therapists who participate in this stuff. I'm not saying it's not a blind spot for those of us who are opposed to it. Like, we all have our shadow, but there's this like grandiosity and omnipotence that it's almost as if the therapist is sending the message to the patient, like, I will follow you around and, sprinkle the ground with roses in front of you. I will make the world a better place for
Yeah.
you. And it, like, who are you to do that?
Mm, yeah. And it's interesting, we've talked about this kind of passing the buck, or the linkage between medical and legal processes. And when they originally passed the Gender Recognition Act, they had this role of the two doctors making giving a medical report on the person and on their psychological state. And part of that was for them to say, this is the right thing for this person to do. But part of it was explicitly to screen out people who were fetishists or to gynophiles doing it for the wrong reason. Um, that was explicitly at the time. They said, there are transvestites and there are transsexuals, and they are two different populations, and the role of the doctor in the Gender Recognition Act was to differentiate between the two. And now they'll deny that any of that exists.
Or that there's anything wrong with it if it does.
Right, exactly. And so that was seen as being, well, that's a safeguard, and the people who kind of pass through that safeguard are in some way sexless, either physically or mentally or whatever. But that the risk of what you're actually doing is giving license for a group of men who are known to be enacting a paraphilia to go out into women's toilets, women's changing rooms, women's sports, boardrooms, and play that out with their colleagues and with strangers, and that women's rights in all that didn't matter at all. And I don't know if the doctors and any of the doctors and therapists that were involved at the time, sort of thinking they were signing up to that, feel any regret about what it is, the sort of Pandora's box that they've opened. They thought, I think some of them thought they were doing something for this very small group of people that they could identify who really, really did need to change sex. But once you sort of untie law from reality, all kinds of weird things happen.
With the current laws that have been passed in the UK, what recourse do women and girls have if they feel that their rights are being violated? So, with regard to uh, girls with boys on their sports teams, female inmates with men in their prisons. Um, I mean, the bathroom thing is like, it's like such a brief passing, and like it's hard to imagine some like brief passing interaction in a bathroom would result in a legal thing, but like,
It is and it isn't. I mean, if you work with somebody, or if I mean, there are kind of random interactions, and
right,
then there are repeated interactions.
true.
And I think a lot of people have said bathrooms and pronouns are, they're kind of easy things to give away as an accommodation very early on in thinking about this. And I think, most people, me included, when I first started thinking about this, I wasn't really thinking about pronouns and bathrooms. I thought, yeah, what's the big deal? But actually, if you can't enforce rules at the level of bathrooms, and if you can't expect people to follow rules at the level of bathrooms, then you kind of give everything away. And the same with pronouns. I mean, if you look at any kind of profession, any organization where you have power and you have people who are vulnerable, and we're all on both sides of that divide in different places. You have traffic rules, you have all kinds of rules to keep people safe because we're in great big systems, um, and those rules are not perfect. Like a speed limit, it could be a bit higher, it could be a bit lower, um, but it is what it is. Police officers are supposed to wear a particular uniform, and that's to show that they are people who follow rules and that you can trust. And yet, if so one of the rules for police officers is they can't wear very strong makeup, and they're not supposed to wear coloured nail polish. Um, but a trans police officer is allowed to wear quite garish makeup and
Hmm.
coloured nail polish, because otherwise you can't actually tell that they think they're a woman.
Hmm.
Because if you've got a police uniform on and no makeup on, you just look like a man.
Hmm.
And so then you've got a police officer who's allowed to break the rules, and then they're signaling to everyone, well, I'm a person who's allowed to break the rules. This is an organization that looks the other way when someone breaks the rules. What other rules can be broken? Um, so even kind of things that you think are little things like bathrooms turn out to be important. And
Oh,
also,
and just to clarify my point, because I don't want anyone misunderstanding me, I do think bathrooms are a big deal. I was just like, my mind was going like, and I think you pointed out correctly that if you work with someone, then that same man is coming into your bathroom day after day. Because I was thinking about all the times I've like seen someone in passing, and I'm like, if I
yeah,
wanted to do something about this, what would I even do? Right. So,
yeah,
but
yeah,
it's not to say it's not a big deal. But I guess
right,
my
right.
question is more about like what recourse legally do people have now?
So there are kind of two things. One is discrimination claims. So I mean, one of the funny things that people have said about this judgment is, oh, well, it only affects the definition of sex in the Equality Act, as if the Equality Act is this really small thing. But the Equality Act covers employment, it covers education, it covers service provision. So like private businesses, public businesses. Um, it covers membership organizations, trade unions. So really, any part of kind of the public realm that you come into contact with, you have the right not to be discriminated against. And obviously, you can't sue everyone all the time. I mean, Sex Matters, you know, the number of times we've been refused service for something or other, and I've had to pick up the phone and say, "Have you heard of the Equality Act? You might want to look up my name," where it's been belief discrimination. But what this definition opens up is sex discrimination. So it's already been shown that, for example, um, not having sufficient women's toilets or not having women's toilets that give women enough privacy is a form of sex discrimination. So if in your work you have a trans woman in the women's toilets, and which is what has happened to a nurse called Sandy Peggy up in Scotland, who encountered a male doctor who identified as a woman in the women's changing room, said, "I feel uncomfortable," several times. He refused to leave. He ended up reporting her for harassing him, and she ended up in an employment tribunal. So you have recourse to law, but obviously that's not everyone can do that. It's public, it's costly, it takes a whole lot of your life, but you only need a few people to do that for the message to get through. I mean, it's taken a while, but the message should get through to employers and service providers not to do this, not to risk a court case. And then the other one is judicial review, which is if it's a public body, you can take them to court for breaking the law. It doesn't even have to be against an individual person. You can just say, this is a public body. Why is it not complying with the law? So that's why I say we're going to be back in court. I think quite a lot before this is done. But the good thing about going to court is they can't run away. They can't say, "Oh, you're so offensive, I'm not talking to you." It's the one place where we get to have the argument is when we drag these people to court.
Let's take a quick break. And when we come back, I want to talk about what you are up to next at Sex Matters, because there's some sort of future-oriented stuff we talked about before we started recording. Are you a therapist in need of continuing education that's not over-the-top woke? Check out my colleague Lisa Mustard's pod courses. All of her pod courses are approved by the National Board for Certified Counselors. Right now, Lisa is offering my listeners an incredible deal. Get all 27 pod courses for only $44. That could meet almost all of your continuing education needs for the year. Visit lisamustard.com/podcourses and use code SOMETherapist to take $5 off of her $49 pod course bundle. Again, use code SOMETherapist at lisamustard.com/podcourses. I'll include that link and coupon in the show notes for your convenience. All right, now back to the show. So we're back, and before we started recording, you had said the next big issue that Sex Matters is working on has to do with digital identity and data. You said it's a big mess. So what did you mean by that?
Like I said, in the UK, people have been allowed to change their personal data in official public systems through a series of ad hoc decisions, not even laws or decisions by government, but just decisions by administrators, some of them lost in the midst of time. So it was back in the 1960s when they first started allowing people to change their sex on a passport. And the reason they did it was because people were going off to Casablanca to go and have a sex change, and they couldn't go as a man and come back as a woman on the same passport. So they'd give them two passports to allow them to do that. And this was a tiny number of people that were doing that, and the passport office thought, well, where's the harm? But what that means is once you've allowed people to change the sex on their passport, which they can do just by filling in a form, they need to get a sort of letter from their doctor, but just their family doctor. They can go in, have a 7-minute consultation, and basically say to their doctor, I'd like to transition. And the doctor signs a letter saying, I know who this patient is. As far as I know, they're telling the truth, but there's no diagnosis there. Or they write their own letter saying, I'm a cross-dresser. I've been cross-dressing for a long time, and now I've decided to live in my female identity. They can change the sex on their passport. And the passport office hasn't historically even kept a record of who's done this. And so what that means is that no one's passport is reliable. So, my passport says F on it. But you can't tell from my passport that I'm not a trans woman. Um, and we don't have a national ID card system. We don't have a national identity number system. We have these different systems. So we have driving licenses, we have passports, we have National Health Service records, and none of them speak to each other. And that's quite nice for privacy. You don't necessarily want each bit of government speaking to each other about you. But having inaccurate data in all of those places means there's nothing that can be used to prove what sex someone is. And on one hand, it's quite a trivial question because, when you see someone face to face, generally you know what sex they are. But, if you're having an argument with people as we are now about, well, what sex person can use this toilet, come to this rape crisis center, apply for this job, it's quite helpful to be able to point at something and say, well, there you go. The government says I'm female. The government says you're not. Sorry, you can't. I mean, Imani Khalif, the Algerian boxer. Obviously that's not a trans issue, but the IOC at the time was saying, well, it says F on her passport, but it says XY in his chromosomes. So not having any official documents that anyone can rely on sort of breaks officialdom. And now the government's in the process of developing a system of digital identity. So instead of having to show your passport or show your driving license or, two bills and your birth certificate, you'll be able to use an app on your phone to show, for example, that you're over 18 to buy alcohol in the pub. And it's a privacy protecting thing. So you unlock it with your fingerprint. It shows your photograph. It shows you're over 18. Doesn't show your name. Doesn't show your date of birth. All that kind of information which you would reveal if you were using an analog document. It keeps that private when you don't need to show it, and you're just showing you're over 18, which is a good thing. If a young woman in a pub needs to show she's over 18, doesn't necessarily want to give the barman her name, for example, it's a good thing. And so that if we had accurate records of sex, this would solve the privacy problem that Christine Goodwin said was the one that led to the UK government breaching his privacy rights, which was having to reveal his sex when he didn't need to. If you had your sex accurately recorded in digital identity, you could share it when you need to. You're signing up for a sport, you're joining the gym, you're signing up for healthcare or social care or something, interpersonal where the other people need to know your sex. But if you're renting a car or, even, buying a house, for example, and you don't want to reveal your sex or you don't want to be put on the spot, and it makes you feel awkward, then you don't have to. All you need to show is that you are the person who owns this identity, this bank account, you're not money laundering, but you don't have to show your sex. So it could be the solution that solves the privacy problem, which is a minimal problem, but it is a problem, and which gets us back to a situation where every public system that records sex records it accurately. And that's really important for things like safeguarding. When you've got a situation with children and adults, you want to know what sex they are. We have Girl Guides, for example, it says it's a single sex organization, but it allows men who identify as women to volunteer as Girl Guide leaders. And they will tell you, no, they're women. And they're not, they're men. But because there's no, it's been left to every single organization to have to say whether they defend truth or not. And it turns out almost no organizations do defend truth. Not having a kind of bedrock of computer says no truth, computer gives you the answer, means you're relying on kind of bravery and integrity of organizations, and it turns out they don't have very much of it. So we're trying to get the government to see that either they solve this problem with digital identity or they repeat the problem that already exists with passports, with driving licenses, with NHS numbers. And that means basically they'd be doing self-ID, which they haven't done in law, but they'd be giving people a government-endorsed official ID that they can carry on their phone, that they can hold up and say, "Look, I'm female, let me in." And then, the receptionist, the security guy, how are they supposed to be able to argue against that, against somebody with a government verified female ID? So this is a kind of rubber hits the road thing.
Well, and there's been so much document falsification as it is, given that people have been allowed to not only obtain this so-called gender recognition certificate, which symbolizes their change in status, supposedly, but to be able to falsify historical documents, to be able to go back and change a birth certificate from, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, uh, is just insane. So, I mean, and then you say that the offices that handle passports haven't been tracking those changes. So, how would you propose going about cleaning up this mess?
Well, so the one thing you can't change is your actual birth record. So a birth certificate is really a certified copy of the birth record, which is I mean, I think it's digital now, but it was like they wrote it out in a pen in the registry office when you were born in the UK, and you can't change that. And so what they're giving people when they're giving them a new birth certificate, it's not really a birth certificate. They modeled it on adoption. So when you are adopted, you get a new certificate. But at least in the UK, there are two kinds of certificates. There's a short one and a long one. And if the short one, you can't tell it's an adoption certificate. It looks just like a birth certificate. But the long one, which includes your parents and a bit more detail, says it's an adoption certificate on it. So it's sort of saying this is, it's recognizing a legal reality, but it's not changing a historical document. Whereas what they did with gender reassignment was you can't tell the difference between a gender reassignment certificate and an actual birth certificate. But if you go back to the birth record, you can. And so, like you say, changing a historical document is a huge imposition, and it's an imposition on everybody else because, as with my passport, my birth certificate says female, but you can't tell I'm not a trans woman from my birth certificate. You can tell I'm not a trans woman from the birth record. And because that's now been digitized and the digital system is going to be about different bits of government sharing people's data with their consent, you could now say, okay, ping the birth register. I'd like you to verify that I'm female. And you can do that by pinging that original record from your birth, which hasn't been changed. That's the one historic record that hasn't been changed. And obviously there are other ways of verifying someone's sex. I mean, you could ask their doctor to to give you a truthful, your doctor knows what sex you are. If somebody's playing in sport, they can do a cheek swab test. And you only have to do it once in your lifetime. And then, if it's put on your record, that's good forever. So, it's not that it's technically difficult to know what sex people are, but what you need is a system that keeps good records and bad records separate from each other. Because if you test someone's sex with a cheek swab, but you also allow someone to change their sex in that same data field, then the cheek swab test has become worthless because you could falsify it. And they know this for other things. Dates of birth, you cannot change your date of birth. You can have a birthday party on a different day, but you can't change your date of birth. And they're quite careful of American dates are written differently from European dates, and they want to make sure they don't get your month and your day muddled up, and they don't treat you as a anti-money laundering risk or a fraud risk because they got the days muddled up. So they're very careful of that with dates of birth. They need to have a system of being just as careful about sex. And there's only two values, so it's not that hard.
With the birth records, is there any risk that woke parents can opt out, if they're like, "Well, I don't know what my baby identifies as yet." Is there anything where they can opt out of having their baby's sex recorded?
Not yet. And I mean, it's interesting that um, there have been a lot of cases, trans rights cases, where they've tried to push at different parts of this thing. And one of these cases was a trans man who got pregnant, had a child, and wanted to be recorded on her child's birth certificate as the father. And the government said no. The registrar said no. You're the mother. You have to be recorded as the mother. And so this person took the government to court for that. Said, I should be able to be recorded as the father. And the court said the mother is the person who gives birth. And the reason why is because when a baby is born, you might not know who the father is. You know who the mother is. The mother is the person who is there, who can take charge of that child, who can make decisions, who can protect that child from the state. If you don't have the connection between the mother and the child, that child is at risk. And and then people get married, they get adopted. There are, different ways of making a family. But at the point where a child is born, that child has a mother. And if that child's mother has a gender recognition certificate, which this person did, doesn't make a difference. They're still the mother. And the UK government has also defended against a Californian, non-binary Californian called Ryan Castellucci, who came over to the UK with his Californian gender recognized as being non-binary, and said he wanted a non-binary gender recognition certificate. UK government said no. He's still going. He's trying to go to the Supreme Court now. I think he's been through 3 rounds of court saying he wanted a non-binary recognition, and the UK government has so far dug its heels in. And partly what we're saying to them is, and every time the UK government wins on these cases, what they say is that person has Article 8 rights, privacy rights, private life rights, but that has to be balanced against the ability to administer a state, administrative coherence, which you need in order to keep people safe, in order to have fair laws. And they always say our system is we only have 2 sexes or 2 genders, and therefore you can't be non-binary. And what we say to them is, well, if you're going to defend administrative coherence, you're going to need to have administrative coherence. And right now you don't. I mean, that's why the problem of the Four Women Scotland judgment is causing so much problem, because the law is clear, but there isn't administrative coherence. All of these organizations have been operating outside of the law. And so they're feeling the pain of having to kind of get back in line with the law. But if the government doesn't want to be pushed into adopting non-binary gender recognition, and like you say, parents who don't want their children's sex recorded and mothers who want to be recorded as fathers, they're going to have to defend the principles of administrative coherence about sex and the fact that sex matters.
So, if I'm understanding you correctly, the UK is already moving in a direction where people can use an app as a form of digital ID. And in any given instance where they need to share some identifying information about themselves, they can choose to share only the relevant information. So, I'm imagining that this app would have sort of different settings or modes or features where, for this instance, I only need to demonstrate that I'm over 18. For this instance, I need to demonstrate what my name is. Um, and the app would. So this is already underway, and what you're trying to do with
Yeah.
sex matters is ensure that the way that people's sex is listed in this app is coherent with their birth record.
Right, except it's not just one app. It's the ability of the private sector there can be all different kinds of apps, but it will have like a government trust mark on it. And so what we want to say is if it's got the government trust, and that's the bit that hasn't yet been enacted, so that we've got the private sector apps and we've got a law going through to enable the government trust mark to be put on them, which is how the government they don't want to enact a national ID card system, but they do want people to be able to prove who they are online and via apps. And so what they're doing is providing the kind of trust layer to any private sector player that signs up and that follows the rules. And what we're saying is well, you better make sure those rules guarantee that sex is accurate. Otherwise, you're creating a huge mess. You're creating security risk, safeguarding risk. And because the rules are hard, as in you have to comply with them in order to have the app to use the information, it's going to make, if they don't solve the problem, it's going to make it worse. Because right now, if you know that passport is not reliable, you can, as a women's refuge, if a trans woman says, I want to come, I want to be referred to this women's refuge, look, I've got a female passport, you can say, well, we know, but we understand that passports are not reliable. But this identity app is not going to say this sex data came from a passport. It's just going to say this sex data is accurate. And if you are, I can imagine it'll go into kind of computer networks, like, everyone uses MailChimp or everyone uses Facebook, as the sort of identity layer. This will be the government endorsed identity layer. And so people will want to use it because that's how you refer people around your service, with a government trusted trust mark. But you won't be able to say what their actual sex is. If a women's refuge is referring somebody from one location to another, they'll have to ring up and say, oh, this person really is female, because there's no way of recording it on the computer in a way that you can prove that it's accurate, because the government will have trust marked the inaccurate data.
Sounds like the problem is partly policy and the motivation of the people responsible for making these decisions, and partly technological troubleshooting.
Yeah, and partly cowardice and partly motivation. People can see that it's not a technically difficult problem to solve, but you have to be, brave enough to say that men are not women, and we know that causes trouble. So I think there's a lot of cowardice in government institutions, and then I'm sure there are people who have seen this as an opportunity to promote self-ID and are quite happy for it to get pushed through. And Stonewall, in fact, the organisation that was the big LGB organisation, is now the big LGBT organisation, said publicly that they we tried to get amendments put into this law to guarantee that sex would be accurate, and Stonewall said they were the ones who lobbied to make sure that didn't happen. And they did that without putting out any kind of public statements. We were publishing, here's the research, here's the arguments, here's the human rights, let's talk about it. And they just said, well, we had some quiet words in back rooms and we killed that. But I mean, this is a problem that's not going to go away, and we're going to try and make sure that the government solves it one way or another.
Okay. Well, are there any loose threads we left hanging from any of the many things we've talked about today that you wanted to circle back to or tie up?
I think when we were talking about therapists and, the medical legal thing, we're still getting to grips with what are the implications of this judgment and of the fact that there are two sexes. And when it comes to single sex services, sex means sex. I think that is going to have big implications for therapy and for, child gender medicine in particular, because you just can't promise these children children and young people what has been promised to them. You can't promise them that they can, play sports as the opposite sex, that they can use facilities as the opposite sex. There is a responsibility on society to accommodate everybody, and people have, all kinds of different needs, but that's quite a limited responsibility. I think it's going to come down to, well, there are unisex facilities in sort of most big buildings now. People can say, mind your own business about what their sex is, both digitally in terms of digital ID and practically in terms of which facilities they use, but everyone can use their eyes and, come to their own conclusions. And so that promise of being able to disappear into the opposite sex just can't be made anymore. And what that means, I think, for the ethics of this whole project is, is still to play out, but it's big.
That's a very interesting point that you raised. And, personally, I met a lot of gender critical people online from the UK, including some wonderful therapists who are on Team Sanity as far as this issue is concerned. But when I think about those sort of activist therapists who I've had much more up close and personal interaction with them in the US, but I know sort of the psychological profile of the activist therapist. And I would love to interpret what you're saying optimistically, that and the implications of that would be that even diehard true believers who were therapists would have to say, "I'm really sorry, but, as much as we can, so-called transition your gender, here are the limitations of what that will mean for you." I wish I could think that, but I think what I'm left to believe is more likely is that those diehard true believers are, if anything, more likely to sort of double down, right? That they will keep sort of coddling the victim mentality in their patients, right? That looks at these judgments and these events as more evidence of their existing worldview, which is that we are this horribly oppressed minority who's being discriminated against and everyone hates us and there's so much transphobia in the world and it's such a tough, scary time to be this way. But this is who I am and and it almost not only does it enable a victim mentality, but there's almost sort of this like false gratification of being on some kind of hero's journey with it. Like, wow, I am fighting such a tough battle. I'm such a strong person. And so I can imagine that those same therapists who want to send the message that, I'm going to go out and pave the world for you to make it an easier place for you, that they're still gonna be sending that same message. It might have a slightly different undercurrent. It might be more paranoid sounding or, more we have to be careful, but I guess I find myself not feeling particularly optimistic that this sort of thing would affect how my profession conducts itself. I don't know, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the big vector in between those two things is schools, because, schools are the place where other people's rights matter. The institution is looking after a whole cohort of children's welfare. And I mean, it's interesting that the Form in Scotland case was about gender recognition certificates, and no one under the age of 18 has a gender recognition certificate. So formally, it doesn't really affect schools in such a big way. But because it's made clear the concept and the categories and the the promises that can be made to a child as they grow up. I think that the big place where we have to um, kind of win this for team reality is in schools, and then I think it would be much harder for even the most diehard ideological therapists to tell a child or their parents that they can do something which is going to mean that they can't be in school. They can't promise them things that a school is not allowed to deliver because it has to think about other people's rights. But having said that, when I first got interested in this topic, one of the things that was going on was the Equality and Human Rights Commission was trying to write guidance for schools. So this was in 2018. They still haven't produced that guidance. It was taken on by the Department for Education. There's been various drafts and consultations, and fights about it. They still haven't produced guidance that works, and so teachers are on their own, and often they're driven by the most activist parents or the most activist teachers in their school. Um, it's a mess.
Overall, how hopeful are you feeling about the direction that culture is moving in the UK?
Forum in Scotland was was a big win. And I think, that's not going to go back, but we need to win this in terms of culture and institutions. And I think there's still quite a long road.
All right, well, that feels like a good place to wrap things up. So thank you so much for joining me today, Maya Forstater. Where can people find you?
www.sex-matters.org and Twitter.
All right, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for listening to You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist. If you enjoyed this episode, kindly take a moment to rate, review, share, or comment on it using your platform of choice. And of course, please remember, podcasts are not therapy, and I'm not your therapist. Special thanks to Joey Pecoraro for this awesome theme song, Half Awake, and to Pods by Nick for production. For help navigating the impact of the gender craze on your family, be sure to check out my program for parents, ROGD Repair. Any resource you heard mentioned on this show, plus how to get in touch with me, can all be found in the notes and links below. Rain or shine, I hope you will step outside to breathe the air today. In the words of Max Ehrmann, with all its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it is still a beautiful world.